Chapter 18 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 18. Dr. Thomas Burnet. It was only a very narrow accident which prevented Dr. Burnet, an ultra freethinker in the Church of England, from becoming Archbishop of Canterbury at the death of Tillotson. A combination of clergymen were prepared to immolate themselves, providing Burnet could be overthrown. They succeeded. Thomas Burnet kept the Charter House in London and his conscience, happier perhaps in this than if he had enjoyed the ecclesiastical preferment which King William seemed so anxious to give him. Amongst the clergy, Dr. Burnet was, with the single exception of Dean Swift, the greatest freethinker of whom we can boast, who held an influential position in the church. This position is sometimes claimed for Bishop Berkeley, a man of vast talents, a sincere Christian, although an innovator in philosophy. Thomas Burnet was born in the year 1635. At the age of 45, he published the work in Latin with which his name is generally associated, The Sacred Theory of the Earth, containing an account of the original of the earth, and of all the general changes which it has already undergone, or is to undergo till the consummation of all things. This book gives us an idea, formed by its author, of the origin of the world, and is remarkable as one of the first grand prophecies of geology. Although of little value to us, it produced an impression upon the age by depicting the various strata of the mountainous regions, and comparing them in different countries, eliminating ideas of the nature of the vast changes we see in the universe, tracing the rise of most of the phenomena from the two elements, fire and water. Burnet thought that at one time the whole of matter was in a fluid state, revolving round a central sun, until the heavier particles sunk into the middle, and formed the stony strata which supports the earth, over which the lighter liquids coalesced until the heat of the sun effectually separated water from land. This is the foundation of a scheme which is elaborated in a poetic style, abounding in eloquent descriptions. In fact, it is a philosophic prose poem of almost unalloyed beauty. In it there is some resemblance to the measured sentences of Shaftesbury, although unequal to that fine writer in soundness of judgment or practical usefulness. In 1691, an English translation was published. By far the most interesting work to us of Burnet's, also written in Latin, is Archaeologia Philosophical, or an account of the opinion of the ancients on various philosophical problems. This work created great opposition by its free remarks on the Mosaic dispensation, although the writer in this, as in the case of his posthumous works, strongly protested against their being translated into the English language, as he was justly afraid of their influence on the minds of the laity, and from his high official station, with the influence his vast learning and his connection with Tillotson and the court gave him, he was no doubt apprehensive that the really religious champions of the Church of England would denounce him when exposed to the temptation of high church preferment. Fragments of those works were translated by the clergy to prove to the unlearned what a dangerous character Thomas Burnet was. Charles Blount, writing to Gildon, said, "I have, according to my promise, sent you herewith the 7th and 8th chapters, as also the appendix of the great and learned Dr. Burnet's book, published this winter in Latin, and by him dedicated to our most gracious sovereign, King William. As for the piece itself, I think it is one of the most ingenious I have ever read, and full of the most acute as well as learned observations. Nor can I find anything worthy an objection against him, as some of the censorious parts of the world pretend, who would have you believe it a mere burlesque upon Moses, and destructive to the notion of original sin, wherefore, by consequence, say they, there could be no necessity of a redemption, which, however, I think no necessary consequence; but for my part, either the great veneration I have for the Doctor's extraordinary endowments, or else my own ignorance has so far bribed me to his interests, that I can by no means allow of any of those unjust reflections the wholesale merchants of credulity, as well as their unthinking retailers, make against him. It is true, in the 7th chapter, he seems to prove that many parts of the Mosaic history of the creation appear inconsistent with reason, and in the 8th chapter the same appears no less inconsistent with philosophy. Wherefore he concludes, as many fathers of the church have done before him, that the whole rather seems to have been but a pious allegory. Dr. Burnet took the meaning of much of the Bible to be but a pious allegory, and as such he strove to popularize it with the clergy. We do not believe that he intended to enlighten any but the clergy. He foresaw the flood of fierce democracy, and like other able men with vested rights in the ignorance of the people, he strove to temporize, to put off still further the day of Christianity's downfall. We place him in this biographical niche, not because he dashed into the fray like bold Hobbes or chivalrous Woolston, and took part in the battle of priestcraft because he thought it was right, but rather because he was a freethinker in disguise, longing for episcopal honors, yet by one false step, the publishing of Archologia, lost an archbishopric, and gave the authority of a great name to struggling opinion. His ascension to our ranks was a brilliant accident. He died at the age of 80 years in 1715. After his demise, 2 works were translated and published, both expressive of his liberal views. The first, On Christian Faith and Duties, throwing overboard the whole of the speculative tenets of the Bible, and giving practical effect to the morals taught in the New Testament, without striving to refute or even apparently to disbelieve their authority, but advising the clergy to treat them as a dead letter. The other posthumous treatise was, On the State of the Dead and the Reviving, which shadows forth a scheme of Deism, inasmuch as Burnet here flatly contradicts the usual ideas of hell torments or hell fire, while asserting the necessity of those who have not been as good in this life as they ought to be, undergoing a probationary purification before they attained supreme happiness. Yet eventually every human being would inhabit a heavenly Elysium, where perennial pleasure would reign and sorrow be forever unknown. Those sentiments indicate a high degree of liberal culture, although they do not sufficiently embody our ideal of one of the great freethinkers of the past. We should have preferred Burnet if he had systematically opposed the church as Toland or Tyndall, or if he had boldly entered the breach like William Whiston, whose singular talents and faithful honesty separated him alike from the church, dissent, and deism, and left him shipwrecked on the world, an able yet a visionary reformer. With more ability than Chubb, he resembled him in his weak policy. He chose to cut his sneers in slices, and serve them up for a scholarly party, rather than hazard the indignation of the ignorant amongst the clergy. We are, however, certain that, although Thomas Burnet was deficient in many points where he might have done effective service, yet we honor him for the boldness with which he faced the scholars with his Latin works. He threw an apple of discord amongst their ranks, which has served, in a constantly increasing manner, to divide and distract their attention. The result has been a constant internecine war in the church, by which Freethought has largely profited. We conclude our sketch of Dr. Burnet by quoting some extracts from the 7th chapter of the Archaeologia Philosophica, as translated by Charles Blount in the Oracles of Reason, concerning Moses' description of Paradise and the original of things. "We have," says Burnet, "hitherto made our inquiries into the originals of things, as well as after a true knowledge of Paradise amongst the ancients. yet still with reference to sacred writ, where it gave us any manner of light on the subject, but think it altogether unnecessary to define the place or situation of paradise, since in respect to the theory of the earth, it is much the same thing where you place it, providing it be not on our modern earth. Now, if you inquire among the ancient fathers where the situation of it was, either they will have it to be none at all, or else obscure and remote from our understanding. Some of them, indeed, term it an intelligible paradise, but confined to no one particular place, whilst others at the same time make it a sensible one, and here it is they first divided about it, etc. Now the history of paradise, according to Moses, is this: when God had in 6 days finished the creation of the world, the 7th day he rested from all manner of work. And here Moses relates particularly each day's operations. But for the story of mankind, as well male as female, of which he makes a particular treatise by himself. Wherefore, omitting the rest at present, let us consider the Mosaic doctrine upon those 3 subjects, viz., Adam, Eve, and the Garden of Eden, together with those things which are interwoven with them. As to the first man, Adam, Moses says he was formed not out of stones or dragons' teeth, as other cosmists have feigned concerning their men, but out of the dust or clay of the earth. And when his body was formed, God blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man was made a living soul. But after another manner, and of another matter, was the woman built, viz., with one of Adam's small bones. For as Adam lay asleep, God took away one of his ribs, and out of that made Eve. So much for the forming of the first man and woman by the literal text. Moses has likewise given us a large account of their first habitation. He says that God made them in a certain famous garden in the east, and gave it to them as a farm to cultivate and to inhabit, which garden was a most delightful place, watered with 4 several fountains or rivers, planted with trees of every kind. Amongst the trees, in the midst of the garden, stood 2 more remarkable than the rest. One was called the tree of life, the other the tree of death, or of the knowledge of good and evil. God, upon pain of death, prohibits Adam and Eve from tasting the fruit of this tree. But it happened that Eve, sitting solitary under this tree without her husband, there came to her a serpent or adder, which, though I know not by what means or power, civilly accosted the woman, if we may judge of the thing by the event, in these words, or to this purpose. We extract this portion, not for its merits of buffoonery, but to show the real state of mind which could actuate a dignitary of the Church of England in writing it, as the 8th chapter is by far the most philosophical, but we wish to show Burnet's real sentiments. Serpent. All hail, most fair one. What are you doing so solitary and serious under this shade? Eve.
I am contemplating the beauty of this tree.
Serpent. 'Tis truly an agreeable sight, but much pleasanter are the fruits thereof. Have you tasted them, my lady? Eve.
I have not, because God has forbidden us to eat of this tree.
Serpent. What do I hear? What is that God that envies his creatures the innocent delights of nature? Nothing is sweeter, nothing more wholesome than this fruit. Why then should he forbid it? Unless in jest. Eve.
But he has forbid it us on pain of death.
Serpent. Undoubtedly you mistake his meaning. This tree has nothing that would prove fatal to you, but rather something divine and above the common order of nature. Eve.
I can give you no answer, but will go to my husband, and then do as he thinks fit.
Serpent. Why should you trouble your husband over such a trifle? Use your own judgment. Eve.
Let me see. Had I best use it or not? What can be more beautiful than this apple? How sweetly it smells! But it may be it tastes ill.
Serpent, believe me, it is a bit worthy to be eaten by the angels themselves. Do but try, and if it tastes ill, throw it away. Eve.
Well, I'll try. It has indeed a most agreeable flavor. Give me another, that I may carry it to my husband.
Serpent. Very well thought on. Here's another for you. Go to your husband with it. Farewell, young happy woman. In the meantime, I'll go my ways. Let her take care of the rest. Accordingly, Eve gave the apple to the too uxorious Adam, when immediately after their eating of it, they became both, I don't know how, ashamed of their nakedness, and sewing fig leaves together, making themselves a sort of aprons, etc. After these transactions, God in the evening descended into the garden, upon which our first parents fled to hide themselves in the thickest of the trees, but in vain, for God called out, Adam, where art thou? When he, trembling, appeared before God Almighty, and said, Lord, when I heard thee in this garden, I was ashamed because of my nakedness, and hid myself amongst the most shady parts of the thicket. Who told thee, says God, that thou wast naked? Have you eaten of the forbidden fruit? That woman thou gavest me brought it, 'twas she that made me eat it. You have, says God, finely ordered your business, you and your wife. Here, you woman, what is this that you have done? Alas for me, says Adam, thy serpent gave me the apple, and I did eat of it. This apple shall cost you dear, replied God, and not only you, but your posterity, and the whole race of mankind. Moreover, for this crime I will curse and spoil the heavens, the earth, and the whole fabric of nature. But thou, in the first place, vile beast, shalt bear the punishment of thy craftiness and malice. Hereafter shalt thou go creeping on thy belly, and instead of eating apples, shall lick the dust of the earth. As for you, Mrs. Curious, who so much love delicacies, in sorrow shall you bring forth your children. You shall be subject to your husband, and shall never depart from his side unless having first obtained leave. Lastly, as for you, Adam, because you have hearkened more to your wife than to me, with the sweat of your brow shall you obtain both food for her and her children. You shall not gather fruits which as heretofore grew of themselves, but shall reap the fruits of the earth with labor and trouble. May the earth be for thy sake accursed, hereafter grown barren. May she produce thistles, thorns, tares, with other hurtful and unprofitable herbs, and when thou hast here led a troublesome, laborious life, dust thou art. To dust shalt thou return. Great is the force of custom and a preconceived opinion over human minds. Wherefore these short observations of the first originals of men or things, which we receive from Moses, are embraced without the least examination of them. But had we read the same doctrine in a Greek philosopher, or in a rabbinical or a Mahometan doctor, we should have stopped at every sentence with our mind full of objections and scruples. Now this difference does not arise from the nature of the thing itself, but from the great opinion we have of the authority of the writer as being divinely inspired. The author here defines his ideas in reference to fabulous writings, after which he proceeds in his inquiry. But out of what matter the first of mankind, whether male or female, was composed, is not so easily known. If God had a mind to make a woman start from one of Adam's ribs, it is true it seems to be a matter not very proper. But however out of wood, stone, or any other being God can make a woman, and here, by the by, the curious ask whether this rib was useless to Adam, and beyond the number requisite in a complete body. If not, when it was taken away, Adam would be a maimed person, and robbed of a part of himself that was necessary. I say necessary, forasmuch as I suppose that in the fabric of a human body nothing is superfluous, and that no one bone can be taken away without endangering the whole, or rendering it in some measure imperfect. But if, on the other side, you say this rib was really useless to Adam, and might be spared, so that you make him to have only 12 ribs on one side and 13 on the other, they will reply that this is like a monster, as much as if the first man had been created with 3 feet, or 3 hands, or had had more eyes or other members than the use of a human body requires. But in the beginning we cannot but suppose that all things were made with all imaginable exactness. For my part, I do not pretend to decide this dispute, but what more perplexes me is how out of one rib the whole mass of a woman's body could be built. For a rib does not perhaps equal the 1,000th part of an entire body. If you answer that the rest of the matter was taken from elsewhere, certainly, then, Eve might much more truly be said to have been formed out of that borrowed matter, whatever it was, than out of Adam's rib. I know that the rabbinical doctors solve this business quite another way. For they say the first man had 2 bodies, the one male, the other female, who were joined together, and that God, having cloven them asunder, gave one side to Adam for a wife. Plato has, in his Symposium, something very like this story concerning his first man, Erogenus, who was afterwards divided into 2 parts, male and female. Lastly, others conjecture that Moses gave out this original of woman to the end that he might inspire a mutual love between the 2 sexes, as parts of one and the same whole, so as more effectually to recommend his own institution of marriage. But leaving this subject, I will hasten to something else. Now the second article treats of God's garden in Eden, watered with 4 rivers arising from the same spring. Those rivers are by Moses called Pishon, Gishon, Hiddekel, and Perath, which the ancient authors interpret by Ganges, Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates. Nor do I truly think without some reason, for Moses seems to have proposed nothing more than bringing 4 of the most celebrated rivers of the whole earth to the watering of his garden. Ah, but say you, these 4 rivers do not spring from the same source, or come from the same place. 'Tis true, nor any other 4 rivers that are named by the interpreters. Wherefore this objection will everywhere hold good, as well against the ancient as modern writers. But although you should reduce these rivers to only 2, as some do, to Tigris and Euphrates, yet neither have these 2 rivers the same fountainhead. But this is really and truly an evasion, instead of an explanation, to reduce, contrary to the history of Moses, a greater number of rivers to a smaller, only that they may the more conveniently be reduced to the same spring. For these are the words of Moses: "But there comes a river out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it divides itself into 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon," etc., whereby it is apparent that either in the exit or in the entrance of the garden there were 4 rivers, and that these 4 rivers did one and all proceed from the same fountainhead in Eden. Now pray tell me, in what part of the earth is this country of Eden, where 4 rivers arise from one and the same spring? But do not go about to say that only 2 came from that fountain of Eden, and that the other 2 arose from the Tigris or the Euphrates, where they split near the sea, and make as it were a bifrontic figure, since this does by no means answer the words of Moses. Besides, he mentions in the first place Pishon and Gishon, and afterwards Tigris and Euphrates as lesser rivers, whereas you, on the contrary, will have those to be derived from these last as rivers of an inferior order, which is a manifest distorting of the historical account. But to end all these difficulties concerning the channels of the rivers which watered Paradise, you will perhaps at last say that the springs, as well as the courses of rivers, have been changed by the universal deluge, and that we cannot now be certain where it was they burst over the earth, and what countries they passed through. For my part, I am much of your opinion. Providing you confess there happened in the deluge such a disruption of the earth as we suppose there did. But from only an inundation of waters such a change could never happen. Besides, what geography will you have Moses to describe these rivers, antediluvian or postdiluvian? If the latter, there has happened no considerable alteration of the earth since the time of Moses and the flood. If the former, you then render Moses' description of the earth totally superfluous and unuseful to discover the situation of Paradise. Lastly, it is hard to conceive that any rivers, whether these or others, can have subsisted ever since the first beginning of the world, whether you have regard to their water or their channels. The channels of rivers are made by daily attrition. For if they had been made as ditches and furrows are, by earth dug out and heaped on each side, there would certainly have been seen everywhere great banks of earth. But we plainly see that this is only fortuitous, forasmuch as they often run through plains, and the river banks are no more than level with the adjacent fields. Besides, whence could there be had water at the beginning of the world to fill these channels? If you say that on the third day, when the great bed of the ocean was made, the smaller channels of the rivers were also, and as the greatest part of the waters of the abyss fell into the gulf of the seas, so the remaining part descended into these other channels, and therewith formed the primitive rivers. Admitting this, yet the waters would not only be as salt as those of the sea, but there would be no continual springs to nourish these rivers, insomuch as when the first stream of water had flown off, there being no fresh supplies of water to succeed it, these rivers would have been immediately dried up. I say because there were no perpetual springs, for whether springs proceed from rain or from the sea, they could neither way have rose in so short a time, not from rain, for it had not as yet rained, neither was possible, that in the short space of one day the waters of the abyss should run down from the most inland places to the sea, and afterwards returning through ways that were never yet open to them, should strain themselves through the bowels of the earth, and ascend to the heads of their rivers. But of rivers we have said enough. Let us now proceed to the rest. We have, in the third place, a very strange account of a serpent that talked with Eve, and enticed her to oppose God. I must confess, we have not yet known that this beast could ever speak, or utter any sort of voice beside hissing. But what shall we think Eve knew of this business? If she had taken it for a dumb animal, the very speech of it would have so frightened her that she would have fled from it. If, on the other side, the serpent had from the beginning been capable of talking and haranguing, and only lost his speech for the crime of having corrupted the faith of Eve, certainly Moses would have been far from passing over in silence this sort of punishment, and only mentioning the curse of licking the dust. Besides this, will you have the particular species of serpents, or all the beasts in paradise, to have been imbued with the faculty of speaking, like the trees in Dodona's grove? If you say all, pray what offense had the rest been guilty of, that they also should lose the use of their tongues? If only the serpent enjoyed this privilege, how came it about that so vile an animal, by nature the most reverse and remote from man, should, before all his other fellow brutes, deserve to be master of so great a favor and benefit as that of speech? Lastly, since all discoursing and arguing includes the use of reason, by this very thing you make the serpent a rational creature. But I imagine you will solve this difficulty another way; for, say the sticklers for a literal interpretation, under the disguise of a serpent was hid the devil, or an evil spirit, who, using the mouth and organs of this animal, spoke to the woman as though it were a human voice. But what testimony or what authority have they for this? The most literal reading of Moses, which they so closely adhere to, does not express anything of it. For what else does he seem to say, but that he attributes the seducing of Eve to the natural craftiness of the serpent, and nothing else? For these are Moses's words: "Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made." Afterwards, continues he, "The serpent said to the woman, Yea, hath God said, etc." But besides, had Eve heard an animal, by nature dumb, speak through the means of some evil spirit, she would instantly have fled with horror from the monster, when, on the contrary, she very familiarly received it. They argued very amicably together, as though nothing new or astonishing had taken place. Again, if you say that all this proceeded from the ignorance or weakness of a woman, it would on the other side have been but just that some good angels should have succored a poor, ignorant, weak woman. Those just guardians of human affairs would not have permitted so unequal a conflict. For what if an evil spirit, crafty and knowing in business, had by his subtlety overreached a poor, weak, and silly woman, who had not as yet either seen the sun rise or set, who was but newly born, and thoroughly inexperienced? Certainly a person who had so great a price set upon her head as the salvation of all mankind, might well have deserved a guard of angels. Ay, but perhaps you will say, the woman ought to have taken care not to violate a law established on pain of death. "The day you eat of it you shall surely die, both you and yours. This was the law. Die." What does this mean? Says the poor innocent virgin, who as yet had not seen anything dead, no, not so much as a flower, nor had yet with her eyes or mind perceived the image of death, viz., sleep or night. But what you add concerning his posterity and their punishment, that is not all expressed in the law. Now, no laws are ever to be so distorted, especially those that are penal. The punishment of the serpent will also afford no inconsiderable question, if the devil transacted the whole thing under the form of a serpent, or if he compelled the serpent to do or to suffer things. Why did he, the serpent, pay for a crime committed by the devil? Moreover, as to the manner and form of the punishment inflicted on the serpent, that from that time he should go creeping on his belly, it is not to be explained what that meant. Hardly any one will say that prior to his catastrophe the serpent walked upright, like four-footed beasts, and if from the beginning he crept on his belly like other snakes, it may seem ridiculous to impose on this creature as a punishment for one single crime, a thing which, by nature, he ever had before. But let this suffice for the woman and the serpent. Let us now go on to the trees. I here understand those two trees which stood in the middle of the garden, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. The former, so called, that it would give men a very long life, although by what follows we find our forefathers, prior to the flood, lived to very great ages, independent of the tree of life. Besides, if the longevity or immortality of man had depended only upon one tree or its fruit, what if Adam had not sinned? how could his posterity, diffused throughout the whole earth, have been able to come and gather fruit out of this garden, or from this tree? Or how could the product of one tree have been sufficient for all mankind? Such is a condensed abstract of Dr. Burnett's 7th chapter of Archaeologia. The 8th chapter equals the above in boldness, but far exceeds it in breadth of logic and critical acumen, without, however, appearing so iconoclastic or so vulgar. The next chapter abounds in classical quotations. The creation of the world and the deluge is the theme on which so much is advanced, at a time when such language was greeted with the stake and the prison. We cannot calculate the effect of Burnet's work on the clerical mind, but this we do know, that since his day there has progressed an internal revolution in the tenets of the church, which in the last generation gave birth to the neology, now so destructive of the internal peace of the churches. Neology has not come from Deism, for this power assails the outworks of Christianity, while the school of criticism is but a severe pruning knife of internal verbiage. Although the language quoted is harsh, the arguments commonplace, which, although true, are now discarded by the educated Freethinker, yet if for no stronger language than this men were imprisoned only 10 years ago, what must we say to the moral courage which could publish them 150 years ago? There must surely have been greater risks than in our day, and when a man dare hazard the highest power of the church for the duty of publishing unpopular sentiments, it is clearly our duty to enshrine him as one of the guardians of that liberty of thought and speech, which have won for us a freedom we cherish and protect. Let the earth then lie lightly over the priest Freethinker, Thomas Burnet. End of chapter 18. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. If you'd like, you may follow me on Twitter at ThatDarnTed. Chapter 19 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 19. Thomas Paine. The wise, by some centuries before the crowd, must, by their novel systems, though correct, of course offend the wicked, weak, and proud, must meet with hatred, calumny, neglect. Thomas Paine, the sturdy champion of political and religious liberty, was born at Thetford in the country of Norfolk, England, 29th of January, 1737. Born of religious parents, his father being a Quaker and his mother a member of the Church of England, Paine received a religious education at Thetford Grammar School, under the Reverend William Knowles. At an early age he gave indications of his great talent, and found pleasure when a boy in studying poetical authors. His parents, however, endeavored to check his taste for poetry, his father probably thinking it would unfit him for the denomination to which he belonged. But Paine did not lose much time before experimenting in poetry himself. Hence we find him, when 8 years of age, composing the following epitaph upon a fly being caught in a spider's web: Here lies the body of John Crow, who once was high, but now is low. Ye brother Crows, take warning all, for as you rise, so must you fall. At the age of 13, after receiving a moderate education in reading, writing, and arithmetic, Paine left school to follow his father's trade, stay-making. Although disliking the business, he pursued this avocation for nearly 5 years. When about 20 years of age, however, he felt, as most enterprising young men do feel, a desire to visit London, and enter into the competition and chances of a metropolitan life. His natural dislike to his father's business led him to abandon for a period his original occupation, and after working some time with Mr. Morris, a noted staymaker in Long Acre, he resolved upon a seafaring adventure, of which he thus speaks: "At an early age, raw, adventurous, and heated with the false heroism of a master, Rev. Mr. Knowles, master of the grammar school at Thetford, who had served in a man of war, I began my fortune, and entered on board the terrible Captain Death. From this adventure I was happily prevented by the affectionate and moral remonstrances of a good father, who, from the habits of his life, being of the Quaker profession, looked on me as lost. But the impression, much as it affected me at the time, wore away, and I entered afterwards in the King of Prussia privateer, Captain Mender, and went with her to sea." Sea life did not, as may be supposed, long satisfy a mind like Paine's. In April, 1759, after working nearly 12 months at Dover, we find him settled as master staymaker at Sandwich, marrying, on September 27th, Mary Lambert, daughter of an exciseman of that place. But this matrimonial happiness was of short duration, his wife dying the following year. Disgusted with the toil and inconvenience of his late occupation, Paine now renounced it forever, to apply himself to the profession of exciseman. After 14 months' study, he obtained the appointment of supernumerary in the excise, which he held with intervals till 1768, when he settled as exciseman at Levis, in Sussex, and married, 1771, Elizabeth Olive, daughter of a tobacconist, whose business he succeeded to. About this time Paine wrote several little pieces, in prose and verse, among which was the celebrated song on the death of General Wolfe, and the trial of Farmer Carter's dog Porter. The latter is a composition of exquisite wit and humor. In 1772, the excise officers throughout the kingdom were dissatisfied with their salaries, and formed a plan to apply to Parliament for an increase. Paine, being distinguished among them as a man of great talent, was solicited to draw up and state their case, which he did in a pamphlet entitled, "The Case of the Salary of the Officers of Excise, and Thoughts on the Corruption arising from the Poverty of Excise Officers." 4,000 copies of this pamphlet were printed and circulated. Some time after this publication, Paine, being in the grocery business, was suspected of unfair practices, and was dismissed by the excise, after being in it 12 years. This suspicion, however, was never shown to be just. But to show how very vigorous the authorities were in suppressing smuggling, we will quote the following letter from Clio Rickman to the editor of the Independent Whig, in October, 1807. "Sir, if there are any characters more to be abhorred than others, it is those who inflict severe punishments against offenders, and yet themselves commit the same crimes. If any characters more than others deserve execration, exposure, and to be driven from among mankind, it is those governors of the people who break the laws they themselves make, and punish others for breaking. Suffer me, Mr. Editor, thus to preface the following fact. Fact, I say, because I stand ready to prove it so. When Admiral Duncan rendezvoused in the Downs with his fleet, on the 8th of January, 1806, the spider lugger Daniel Fallara, master, was sent to Guernsey to smuggle articles for the fleet, such as wine, spirits, hair powder, playing cards, tobacco, etc., for the supply of the different ships. At her arrival in the Downs, the ship's boats flocked round her to unload her and her contraband cargo. A custom house extra boat, commanded by William Wallace, seeing the lugger, followed and took her, in doing which he did his duty. On his inspecting the smuggled articles with which she was laden, he found a number of cases directed to Admiral Duncan, the Right Honorable William Pitt, the heaven born minister of England, and to the Right Honorable Henry Dundas, Walmer Castle. In a few days, Wallace, the master of the Custom House cutter, received orders from Government to give the lugger and her smuggled cargo up, on penalty of being dismissed the service, and these cases of smuggled goods were afterwards delivered at the Prime Minister's, Mr. Pitt, at Walmer Castle. Mr. Editor, read what follows, and repress your indignation if you can. There are now in Deal jail 14 persons for trifling acts of smuggling, compared to the above of the Right Honorable William Pitt and the now Right Honorable Lord Melville. The former were poor, and knew not how to live. The latter were most affluently and splendidly supported by the people, that is, they were paupers upon the generous public, towards whom they thus scandalously and infamously conducted themselves. I am, Sir, your humble servant, Cleo Rickman. To those opponents of Thomas Paine who attach any weight to his dismissal from the excise on suspicion of smuggling, we would mention the fact that during Paine's service at Levis, Mr. Jenner, the principal clerk in the Excise Office, London, wrote several letters from the Board of Excise, thanking Mr. Paine for his assiduity in his profession, and for his information and calculations forwarded to the office. Shortly after his dismissal, Mr. Paine and his wife, by mutual agreement, separated. Many tales have been put in circulation respecting the separation. Cleo Rickman, in his Life of Paine, has the following passage: "That he did not cohabit with her from the moment they left the altar till the day of their separation, a space of 3 years, although they lived in the same house together, is an indisputable truth. It is also true that no physical defect on the part of Mr. Paine can be adduced as a reason for such conduct. Mr. Paine's answer, upon my once referring to this subject, was, 'It is nobody's business but my own. I had cause for it, but I will name it to no one.' This I can assert, that Mr. Paine always spoke tenderly and respectfully of his wife, and sent her several times pecuniary aid, without her knowing even whence it came." In 1774, Paine left England and arrived at Philadelphia, a few months before the battle of Lexington. He made his appearance in the New World as editor of the Pennsylvanian Magazine, and it would appear that he then had in view the coming struggle, in which he took so prominent a part, for in his introduction to the first number of the above magazine he states, "Thus encompassed with difficulties, this first number of the Pennsylvanian Magazine entreats a favorable reception, of which we shall only say that, like the early snowdrop, it comes forth in a barren season, and contents itself with foretelling the reader that choicer flowers are preparing to appear." Upon the foreign study of gunpowder being prohibited, he proposed a plan in the Pennsylvanian Journal of a saltpetre association for the voluntary supply of that article of destruction. On the 10th of January, 1776, Common Sense was published, its circulation soon reaching 100,000 copies. The effect this remarkable pamphlet produced upon the minds of the American people, and the share it had in bringing to a successful issue the then pending struggle, may be gathered even from Paine's bitterest enemies. Mr. Cheetham, in his Life of Paine, while endeavoring to damage the author of Common Sense, admits the value of this pamphlet. He says, "This pamphlet of 40 octavo pages, holding out relief by proposing independence to an oppressed and despairing people, was published in January, 1776, speaking a language which the colonists had felt, but not thought of. Its popularity, terrible in its consequences to the parent country, was unexampled in the history of the press. At first involving the colonists in the crime of rebellion, and pointing to a road leading inevitably to ruin, it was read with indignation and alarm. But when the reader, and every one read it, recovering from the first shock, reperused it, its arguments nourishing his feelings and appealing to his pride, reanimated his hopes, and satisfied his understanding that common sense, backed by the resources and force of the colonies, poor and feeble as they were, could alone rescue them from the unqualified oppression with which they were threatened. The unknown author, in the moments of enthusiasm which succeeded, was an angel sent from heaven to save from all the horrors of slavery by his timely, powerful, and unerring counsels, a faithful but abused, a brave but misrepresented people. Another of Paine's enemies and slanderers, Elkanah Watson, in a volume recently published entitled Men and Times of the Revolution, after speaking in very disparaging terms of Paine's appearance, habits, and disposition, which is proved false by the best of testimony, admits the service rendered to America by common sense. He says, "Yet I could not repress the deepest emotions of gratitude toward him, as the instrument of Providence in accelerating the declaration of our independence. He certainly was a prominent agent in preparing the public sentiment of America for that glorious event. The idea of independence had not occupied the popular mind, and when guardedly approached on the topic, it shrunk from the conception, as fraught with doubt, with peril, and with suffering. In 1776 I was present at Providence, Rhode Island, in a social assembly of most of the prominent leaders of the State. I recollect that the subject of independence was cautiously introduced by an ardent Whig, and the thought seemed to excite the abhorrence of the whole circle. A few weeks after, Paine's Common Sense appeared, and passed through the continent like an electric spark. It everywhere flashed conviction, and aroused a determined spirit, which resulted in the Declaration of Independence, upon the 4th of July ensuing. The name of Paine was precious to every Whig heart, and had resounded throughout Europe." Other testimony could be given to Paine's influence in the American struggle for independence, but after the two already mentioned from his opponents, it is unnecessary to give further proof. In the same year that Common Sense appeared, Paine accompanied General Washington and his army, being with him in his retreat from the Hudson River to the Delaware. Although great terror prevailed, Paine stood brave and undismayed, conscious he was advocating a just cause, and determined to bring it to a successful issue. He occupied himself in inspiring hope in the Americans, showing them their strength and their weakness. This object drew from his pen "The Crisis," a continuation of the Common Sense, which was issued at intervals till the cessation of hostilities. In 1777, Paine was unanimously and unknown to himself appointed Secretary in the Foreign Department, where he formed a close friendship with Dr. Franklin. He did not retain his office, however, long, as he refused to become a party to the fraudulent demands of a Mr. Silas Deane, one of the American commissioners then in Europe, and he resigned the office. In 1780 he was chosen member of the American Philosophical Society, having previously received the degree of Master of Arts from the University of Philadelphia. When the independence of America was attained, and when oppression had received a severe and lasting check in that rising country, we find that Paine, so far from being satisfied with his success in the New World, began to look for a fresh field where he might render good service to the cause of right and freedom. Accordingly, in 1787, he visited Paris, his famous services to America giving him a welcome by those who knew the benefit arising from the establishment of human rights. His stay in Paris at this time was of short duration, as he returned to England after an absence of 13 years on September 3rd. After visiting his mother, and settling an allowance of 9 shillings per week for her support, he resided for a short time at Rotherham, in Yorkshire, where an iron bridge was cast and erected upon a model of his invention, which obtained him great reputation for his mathematical skill. The publication of Mr. Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution, called from Paine his Rights of Man, a book that created great attraction and sold nearly 1.5 million copies. In politics Paine was clear and decided, and from his moderation what is called sound. For the perusal of those who may not have read it, we give the following quotations to show the principles upon which it is based. Mr. Burke talks about what he calls an hereditary crown, as if it were some production of nature, or as if, like time, it had a power to operate not only independently, but in spite of man, or as if it were a thing or a subject universally consented to. Alas, it has none of those properties, but is the reverse of them all. It is a thing in imagination, the property of which is more than doubted, and the legality of which in a few years will be denied. But to arrange this matter in a clearer view than what general expressions can convey, it will be necessary to state the distinct heads under which what is called an hereditary crown, or, more properly speaking, an hereditary succession to the government of a nation, can be considered, which are, first, the right of a particular family to establish itself; secondly, the right of a nation to establish a particular family. With respect to the first of these heads, that of a family establishing itself with hereditary powers on its own authority, and independent of the consent of a nation, all men will concur in calling it despotism, and it would be trespassing on their understanding to attempt to prove it. But the second head, that of a nation establishing a particular family with hereditary powers, does not present itself as despotism on the first reflection. But if men will permit a second reflection to take place, and carry that reflection forward but one remove out of their own persons to that of their offspring, they will then see that hereditary succession becomes in its consequences the same despotism to others, which they reprobated for themselves. It operates to preclude the consent of the succeeding generations, and the preclusion of consent is despotism. When the person who at any time shall be in possession of a government, or those who stand in succession to him, shall say to a nation, I hold this power in contempt of you, it signifies not on what authority he pretends to say it. It is no relief, but an aggravation to a person in slavery, to reflect that he was sold by his parent; and as that which heightens the criminality of an act cannot be produced to prove the legality of it, hereditary succession cannot be established as a legal thing. Notwithstanding the taxes of England amount to almost 17 millions a year, said to be for the expenses of government, it is still evident that the sense of the nation is left to govern itself by magistrates and jurors, almost at its own charge, on republican principles, exclusive of the expense of taxes. The salaries of the judges are almost the only charge that is paid out of the revenue. Considering that all the internal government is executed by the people, the taxes of England ought to be the lightest of any nation in Europe, instead of which they are the contrary. As this cannot be accounted for on the score of civil government, the subject necessarily extends itself to the monarchical part. If a law be bad, it is one thing to oppose the practice of it, but it is quite a different thing to expose its errors, to reason on its defects, and show cause why it should be repealed, or why another ought to be substituted in its place. I have always held it an opinion, making it also my practice, that it is better to obey a bad law, making use at the same time of every argument to show its errors and procure its repeal, than forcibly to violate it; because the precedent of breaking a bad law might weaken the force, and lead to a discretionary violation of those which are good. As may be supposed, such a work as the Rights of Man, aiming directly at all oppression, regardless of party, could not be allowed to escape the Attorney General's answer. Accordingly, we find a prosecution instituted against it. But instead of prosecuting the author, the publishers were selected. This drew from Paine a long letter to the Attorney General, suggesting the justice of his answering for the book he wrote. On the trial, Mr. (afterwards Lord) Erskine thus spoke of the author of the Rights of Man: "The defendant's whole deportment previous to the publication has been wholly unexceptionable. He properly desired to be given up as the author of the book, if any inquiry should take place concerning it, and he is not affected in evidence, directly or indirectly, with any legal or suspicious conduct, not even with uttering an indiscreet or taunting expression, nor with any one matter or thing inconsistent with the best subject in England." On the 12th of September, 1792, Mr. Achilles Audibert came expressly to England from the French Convention, to solicit Paine to attend and aid them by his advice on their deliberations. On his arrival at Calais, a public dinner was provided, a royal salute was fired from the battery, the troops were drawn out, and there was a general rejoicing throughout the town. Paine was escorted to the house of his friend Mr. Audibert, the chief magistrate of the place, where he was visited by the commandant, and all the municipal officers in forms, who afterwards gave him a sumptuous entertainment in the town hall. The same honor was also paid him on his departure for Paris. Upon his arrival in Paris all was confusion. There were the king's friends mortified and subdued, the Jacobins split up into cavilling faction, some wishing a federative government, some desiring the king's death, and the death of all the nobility, while a portion were more discreet, wishing liberty without licentiousness, and having a desire to redress wrongs without revenge. These few accepted Paine as their leader, and renounced all connection with the Jacobin Club. Paine on all occasions advocated the preservation of the king's life, but his efforts were thwarted by the appointment by Robespierre of Barrère to the office. So anxiously was Paine sought after, that both Calais and Versailles returned him as deputy. To show how the author of the Rights of Man opposed all physical force where reason may be used, it is only necessary to state that when the letter of Dumouriez reached Paris, with the threat of restoring the king, Paine wrote a letter to the Convention stating a plan for readjustment, and was taking it personally when he was informed that a decree had just been passed offering 100,000 crowns for Dumouriez's head, and another making it high treason to propose anything in his favor. Whilst deputy for Calais, Paine was sought and admired by all classes. He dined every Friday for a long period with the Earl of Lauderdale and Dr. Moore, and so frequent were his visitors that he set apart 2 mornings a week for his levee days. He soon, however, changed his residence, preferring less formality and a more select circle. His History of the French Revolution we are deprived of by his imprisonment, which Gibbon thought would prove a great loss. The historian often applied for the manuscript, believing it to be of great worth. The opinion Paine held of the Revolution may be gathered from the following: "With respect to the Revolution, it was begun by good men, on good principles, and I have ever believed it would have gone on so, had not the provocative interference of foreign powers distracted it into madness, and sown jealousies among the leaders. The people of England have now 2 revolutions, the American and the French, before them. Their own wisdom will direct them what to choose and what to avoid, and in everything which relates to their happiness, combined with the common good of mankind, I wish them honor and success." His speech against the death of the king shows how far he was removed from party spirit, or any feeling of revenge. Whilst he protested against the king being re-enthroned, he equally protested against his death, wishing him removed from the seat of his corruption and placed in a more elevating atmosphere. In treating for the king's safety, he says, "Let then the United States be the safeguard and the asylum of Louis Capet. There, hereafter far removed from the miseries and crimes of royalty, he may learn, from the constant aspect of public prosperity, that the true system of government consists in fair, equal, and honorable representation. In relating this circumstance, and in submitting this proposition, I consider myself as a citizen of both countries." The policy pursued by Paine was not consonant with the views of Robespierre. Consequently, he was seized in the night and imprisoned in the Luxembourg 11 months, without any reason being assigned. The readers are doubtless aware of the many providential escapes he had from the death for which he was seized. While in prison, he wrote part of his Age of Reason, having commenced it just previous to his arrest. Not knowing 1 hour but he might be executed, and once being on the verge of death from fever. He knew the prejudice the Age of Reason would create, so he left its production to the latter part of his life, not wishing to make that an impediment to the good he sought to accomplish in the political world. After toiling in France to bring the Revolution to a just termination, and finding his efforts rendered abortive by that feeling which former oppression had created, he resolved to return to America, a country he saw thriving by a policy he wished to institute in France. In 1802, Jefferson, then President of America, knowing his wish to return, wrote him the following letter: "You express a wish in your letter to return to America by a national ship. Mr. Dawson, who brings over the treaty, and who will present you with this letter, is charged with orders to the captain of the Maryland to receive and accommodate you back if you can be ready to return at such a short warning. You will in general find us returned to sentiments worthy of former times. In these it will be your glory to have steadily labored, and with as much effect as any man living. That you may live long to continue your useful labors, and reap the reward in the thankfulness of nations, is my sincere prayer. Accept the assurance of my high esteem and affectionate attachment. Thomas Jefferson." But circumstances prevented Paine going by the Maryland. He sailed, however, on the 1st of September, 1802, in the London Packet. He had often previously arranged to return to America, but luckily Providence prevented him. One ship that he intended to sail by was searched by English frigates for Thomas Paine, and another sunk at sea, whilst at other times British frigates were cruising off the ports from which he was to sail, knowing him to be there. So much religious misrepresentation has been circulated about Paine's life and death, that it becomes a duty to restate the facts. The manner of life Paine pursued may be gathered from the reliable testimony of Clio Rickman. He says, "Mr. Paine's life in London was a quiet round of philosophical leisure and enjoyment. It was occupied in writing, in a small epistolary correspondence, in walking about with me to visit different friends, occasionally lounging at coffee houses and public places, or being visited by a select few. Lord Edward Fitzgerald, the French and American ambassadors, Mr. Sharp, the engraver, Romney, the painter, Mrs. Wollstonecraft, Joel Barlow, Mr. Hull, Mr. Christie, Dr. Priestley, Dr. Towers, Colonel Oswald, the walking Stewart, Captain Sampson Perry, Mr. Tuffin, Mr. William Chopin, Captain de Stark, Mr. Hometooke, etc., were among the number of his friends and acquaintances." His manner of living in France and America has already been noticed. The perverted tales of Carver and Cheetham may be utterly disproved by referring to Clio Rickman's Life of Paine. As his life, so was his death. When he became feeble and infirm in January, 1809, he was often visited by those good people who so often intrude upon the domestic quiet of the afflicted. After the visit of an old woman, come from the Almighty, whom Paine soon sent back again, he was troubled with the Reverend Milledollar and the Reverend Mr. Cunningham. The latter reverend said, "Mr. Paine, we visit you as friends and neighbors. You have now a full view of death. You cannot live long, and whoever does not believe in Jesus Christ will assuredly be damned." "Let me," said Paine, "have none of your popish stuff. Get away with you. Good morning. Good morning." Another visitor was the Reverend Mr. Hargrove, with this statement: "My name is Hargrove, sir. I am minister of the New Jerusalem Church. We, sir, explain the Scripture in its true meaning. The key has been lost these 4,000 years, and we have found it." "Then," said Paine, in his own neat way, "it must have been very rusty." Shortly before his death, he stated to Mr. Hicks, to whom he had sent to arrange his burial, that his sentiments in reference to the Christian religion were precisely the same as when he wrote the Age of Reason. On the 8th of June, in the words of Clio Rickman, 1809, about 9 in the morning, he placidly, and almost without a struggle, died as he had lived, a deist, aged 72 years and 5 months. He was interred at New Rochelle, upon his own farm, a handsome monument being now erected where he was buried. It has been the object in the present sketch rather to give, in a brief manner, an account of Paine's life and services, than an elucidation of his writings. His works are well known, and they will speak for themselves, but much wrong is done to his memory by the perversions and misrepresentations of the religious publications. No doubt, had his views been different on religious subjects, he would have been held up as a model of genius, perseverance, courage, disinterestedness of purpose, and purity of life, by the men who now find him no better name than the blasphemer. We hope that those not previously acquainted with the facts of his life will find in the present sketch sufficient reason to think and speak otherwise of a man who made the world his country, and the doing good his religion. As Euclid near his various writings shown, his pen inspired by glorious truth alone, o'er all the earth diffusing light and life, subduing error, ignorance, and strife, raised man to just pursuits, to thinking right, and yet will free the world from woe and falsehood's night. To this immortal man, to Paine 'twas given, to metamorphose earth from hell to heaven. End of chapter 19 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. Recorded for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Chapter 20 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 20. Baptiste de Mirabeau. Jean-Baptiste de Mirabeau was born at Paris in the year 1675. Of his early life we can glean but very scanty information. He appears first to have embraced the military profession, but it not being consonant with his general character, he soon quitted the army and devoted himself to literature. He was, however, nearly 49 years of age before he became known in the literary world. He then published a French translation of Tasso's Jerusalem, which brought him much fame, and many of the contributors to the French Encyclopedia appear to have associated with him and courted his friendship. He was afterwards elected a member of the French Academy, of which he became the secretary in 1742. Mirabeau was a constant visitor at the house of his friend the Baron d'Holbach, down to the period of his death. He wrote The World, Its Origin and Its Antiquity, Opinions of the Ancients upon the Jews, Sentiments of the Philosophers upon the Nature of the Soul, and other minor works. The system of nature was also for many years attributed to Mirabeau, but it appears now to be extremely doubtful whether he ever wrote a single line of the work. The Abbé Galliani was one of the first who pointed out D'Holbach as the author. In the Memoirs of M. Suard, edited by M. Garat, the same hypothesis is supported with additional firmness. Dugald Stewart seems to put much faith in the latter authority as fixing the authorship of the System of Nature upon D'Holbach. Voltaire attributes the work to Damilaville in a somewhat positive manner, for which he is sharply criticized in the Biographie Universelle, published in 1817. The System of Nature is a book of which Dugald Stewart speaks as the boldest, if not the ablest work of the Parisian atheists, and it has undoubtedly obtained great popularity. Voltaire, who has written against the System of Nature in a tone of bitter sarcasm, and who complains of its general dullness and prolixity, yet admits that it is often humorous, sometimes eloquent. It certainly is not written in that lively but rather superficial style which has characterized many of the French writers, but it speaks in plain yet powerful language, evincing an extensive acquaintance with the works of previous philosophers, and much thought in relation to the subjects treated upon. Some of its pages, exhibiting more vivacity than the rest of the book, have been attributed to Diderot, who, it is alleged by Marmontel and others, aided by his pen and counsel many of the free-thinking works issued during his life. The System of Nature was not published during the lifetime of Mirabeau, and it is therefore impossible to use any argument which might have been based upon Mirabeau's conduct in relation to it. Mirabeau died in Paris in 1760, at the advanced age of nearly 86 years. Contemporary with him were D'Alembert, D'Holbach, Voltaire, Diderot, Helvetius, Condorcet, Buffon, Rousseau, Frederick II. of Prussia, Montesquieu, Grimm, Sir William Tempte, Toland, Tyndall, Edmund Halley, Hume, Gibbon, Adam Smith, Franklin, and Darwin, forming a roll of names whose fame will be handed down to posterity for centuries to come, as workers in the cause of man's redemption from mental slavery. If, as it appears very probably, it be the fact that Mirabeau had but little part in the authorship of La Système de la Nature, D'Holbach, in using the name of his deceased friend, only associated him with a work which, judging from his other writings, the tenor of his life, and the noble character of his associates, Mirabeau would have issued with pride himself, had the book been really written by him. End chapter 20. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Chapter 21 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 21. Baron D'Holbach. Paul Therry, Baron D'Holbach, was born at Heidesheim in the Palatinate in the month of January, 1723. His father appears to have been a very wealthy man, and brought his son to Paris for the purpose of superintending his education, but died while he was still a child. In his youth, D'Holbach appears to have been noted for his studious habits and retentive faculties, and ultimately attained to some eminence in chemistry and mineralogy. He married when very young, and he had not been married 1 year when his wife died. He afterwards obtained a dispensation from the Pope, and married his deceased wife's sister, by whom he had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. D'Holbach appeared to have spent the greater part of his life in Paris, and for 40 years he assembled around his table every Sunday the elite of the literary world, including nearly the whole of those who took part in the first encyclopedia. If that table were only in the hands of some of our spirit friends of the present day, what brilliant anecdotes might it not rap out! The sparkling wit of Diderot, the good humor of our host, the hospitable and generous D'Holbach, the occasional bitterness of Jean Jacques Rousseau, the cautious expression of opinion by D'Alembert, the agreeable variety of Montesquieu, and the bold enthusiasm of the youthful but hard-working Naigeon. If ever a table were inclined to turn, this table should have been. But perhaps it may be that tables never turn when reason is the ruler of those who sit around. It seems more than probable that D'Holbach at first held opinions differing widely from those entertained by him during the later periods of his life, and it is asserted that Diderot contributed much to this change of opinion. D'Holbach was an amiable man of the world, fond of amusement, and without pretension. He was, notwithstanding, well versed in Roman and Grecian literature, mathematics, chemistry, botany, and modern languages. He was generous to every one. "I content myself," he said, "with performing the disagreeable character of benefactor, when I am forced to do it. I do not wish to be repaid by money, but I am pleased when I meet with some little gratitude, if it be only as proving that the persons I have assisted were such sort of men as I desired." Although about 45 works are now ascribed to D'Holbach, not one of them was published during his lifetime in his own name. The manuscripts were taken to Amsterdam by Naigeon, and there printed by Michael Ray. D'Holbach never talked publicly of his literary productions himself, and his secrets seem to have been well kept by his friends. Several of the works were condemned and suppressed by the government, but D'Holbach lived unsuspected and unmolested. The expression used by the avocat, General Séguier, in his Requistoire against the system of nature, is worthy of notice. The Avocat General said, "The restless spirit of infidelity, inimical to all dependence, endeavors to overthrow all political constitutions. Its wishes will not be satisfied until it has destroyed the necessary inequality of rank and condition, and until it has degraded the majesty of kings, and rendered their authority subordinate to the caprices of the mob." Note the 3 words we have italicized. For the first, read unnecessary; for the second, voice; for the third, peoples. We trust that free thought never will be satisfied until it has destroyed the unnecessary inequalities of rank and condition, and rendered it impossible for the authority of kings to be enforced in opposition to the voice of the people. The following description of D'Holbach is given in a little sketch, published by Mr. Watson in 1834, as taken from Grimm's Correspondence. D'Holbach's features were, taken separately, regular, and even handsome, yet he was not a handsome man. His forehead, large and open, like that of Diderot, indicated a vast and capacious mind, but his forehead having fewer sinuosities, less roundness than Diderot's, announced less warmth, less energy, and less fecundity of ideas. A craniologist would say that in both D'Holbach and Diderot the philosophical organs were largely developed, but that Diderot excelled in ideality. D'Holbach's countenance only indicated mildness, and the habitual sincerity of his mind. He was incapable of personal hatred. Though he detested priests and Jesuits, and all other supporters of despotism and superstition, and though when speaking of such people, his mildness and good temper were sometimes transformed into bitterness and irritability, yet it affirmed that when the Jesuits were expelled from France, D'Holbach regarded them as objects of commiseration and of pity, and afforded them pecuniary assistance. The titles of D'Holbach's works may be found in Barbier's Dictionary of Anonymous Works, and in St. Cyran's article of the Biographie Universelle. So, in the little tract before mentioned as published by J. Watson, D'Holbach contributed largely to the first French encyclopedia, and other works of a like character. On the system of nature we have already spoken, and shall rather leave our readers to the work itself than take up more space in discussing its authorship. After having lived a life of comfort, in affluent circumstances, and always surrounded by a large circle of the best men of the day, D'Holbach died on January the 21st, 1789, being then 66 years of age. The priests have never pictured to us any scene of horror in relation to his dying moments. The good old man died cheered and supported in his last struggle by those men whom he had many times assisted in the hard fighting of the battle of life. J. A. Naigeon, who had been his friend for 30 years, paid an eloquent tribute to D'Holbach's memory, in an article which appeared in the Journal de Paris of February the 9th, 1789, and we are not aware that any man has ever written anything against D'Holbach's personal character. Extracts from the System of Nature. Although we may not attempt to express a decided opinion as to the authorship of Le Système de la Nature, we feel it our duty to present some of its principal arguments to the consideration of our readers. The author opens his work with this passage: "Man always deceives himself when he abandons experience to follow imaginary systems. He is the work of nature. He exists in nature. He is submitted to her laws. He cannot deliver himself from them. He cannot step beyond them, even in thought. It is in vain his mind would spring forward beyond the visible world. An imperious necessity ever compels his return. For a being formed by nature, who is circumscribed by her laws, there exists nothing beyond the great whole of which he forms a part, of which he experiences the influence. The beings his imagination pictures as above nature, or distinguished from her, are always chimeras formed after that which he has already seen, but of which it is utterly impossible he should ever form any correct idea, either as to the place they occupy, or their manner of acting. For him there is not, there can be nothing out of that nature which includes all beings. Instead, therefore, of seeking out of the world he inhabits for beings who can procure him a happiness denied by nature, let him study this nature, learn her laws, contemplate her energies, observe the immutable rules by which she acts." Speaking of the theological delusions under which many men labor, and of the mode in which man has been surrounded by those delusions, he says: "His ignorance has made him credulous. His curiosity made him swallow large draughts of the marvelous. Time confirmed him in his opinions, and he passed his conjectures from race to race. For realities, a tyrannical power maintained him in his motions, because by those alone could society be enslaved. It was in vain that some faint glimmerings of nature occasionally attempted the recall of his reason, that slight coruscations of experience sometimes threw his darkness into light. The interest of the few was bottomed on his enthusiasm. Their preeminence depended on his love of the wonderful. Their very existence rested on the solidity of his ignorance. They consequently suffered no opportunity to escape, of smothering even the lambent flame. The many were thus first deceived into credulity, then coerced into submission. At length the whole science of man became a confused mass of darkness, falsehood, and contradictions, with here and there a feeble ray of truth, furnished by that nature of which he can never entirely divest himself, because, without his knowledge, his necessities are continually bringing him back to her resources. Having stated that by nature he means the great whole, our author complains of those who assert that matter is senseless, inanimate, unintelligent, etc., and says, "Experience proves to us that the matter which we regard as inert or dead, assumes action, intelligence, and life, when it is combined in a certain way. If flour be wetted with water, and the mixture closed up, it will be found, after some little lapse of time, by the aid of a microscope, to have produced organized beings that enjoy life, of which the water and the flour were believed incapable. It is thus that inanimate matter can pass into life, or animate matter, which is in itself only an assemblage of motion. Reasoning from analogy, which the philosophers of the present day hold perfectly compatible, the production of a man, independent of the ordinary means, would not be more marvellous than that of an insect with flour and water. Fermentation and putrefaction evidently produce living animals. We have here the principle. With proper materials, principles can always be brought into action. That generation which is styled equivocal is only so for those who do not reflect, or who do not permit themselves attentively to observe the operations of nature." This passage is much ridiculed by Voltaire, who asserts that it is founded on some experiments made by one Needham, who placed some rye meal in well corked bottles, and some boiled mutton gravy in other bottles, and found that eels were produced in each. We do not know sufficient of the history of Needham's experiments, either to affirm or deny their authenticity, but we feel bound to remind our readers of the much decried experiments conducted by Mr. Cross, and which were afterwards verified by Mr. Weeks, of Sandwich. In these cases, insects were produced by the action of a powerful voltaic battery upon a saturated solution of silicate of potash, and upon ferrocyanurate of potassium. The insects were a species of acarus, minute and semi-transparent, and furnished with long bristles, which could only be seen by the aid of the microscope. The 6th chapter treats of man, and the author thus answers the question, "What is man?" We say he is a material being, organized after a peculiar manner, conformed to a certain mode of thinking, of feeling, capable of modification in certain modes peculiar to himself, to his organization, to that particular combination of matter which is found assembled in him. If again it be asked what origin we give to beings of the human species, we reply, that like all other beings, man is a production of nature, who resembles them in some respects, and finds himself submitted to the same laws; who differs from them in other respects, and follows particular laws determined by the diversity of his conformation. If then it be demanded whence came man, we answer, our experience on this head does not capacitate us to resolve the question, but that it cannot interest us, as it suffices for us to know that man exists, that he is so constituted as to be competent to the effects we witness. In the 7th chapter, the author, treating of the soul and spirit, says, "The doctrine of spirituality, such as it now exists, offers nothing but vague ideas, or rather is the absence of all ideas. What does it present to the mind but a substance which possesses nothing of which our senses enable us to have a knowledge? Can it be truth that man is able to figure to himself a being not material, having neither extent nor parts? which nevertheless acts upon matter without having any point of contact, any kind of analogy with it, and which itself receives the impulse of matter by means of material organs, which announce to it the presence of other beings? Is it possible to conceive the union of the soul with the body? To comprehend how this material body can bind, enclose, constrain, determine a fugitive being which escapes all our senses? Is it honest, is it plain dealing, to solve these difficulties by saying there is a mystery in them, that they are the effects of a power more inconceivable than the human soul, that its mode of acting, however concealed from our view? When to resolve these problems, man is obliged to have recourse to miracles, to make the divinity interfere, does he not avow his own ignorance? When, notwithstanding the ignorance he is thus obliged to avow by availing himself of the divine agency, he tells us, this immaterial substance, this soul, shall experience the action of the element of fire, which he allows to be material. When he confidently says, this soul shall be burnt, shall suffer in purgatory, have we not a right to believe that either he has a design to deceive us, or else that he does not himself understand that which he is so anxious we shall take upon his word? The 9th chapter, after treating of the diversity of the intellectual faculties, proceeds: Man at his birth brings with him into the world nothing but the necessity of conserving himself, of rendering his existence happy. Instructions, examples, the custom of the world, present him with the means, either real or imaginary, of achieving it. Habit procures for him the facility of employing these means. In order that man may become virtuous, it is absolutely requisite that he should have an interest, that he should find advantages in practicing virtue. For this end, it is necessary that education should implant in him reasonable ideas, that public opinion should lean towards virtue as the most desirable good, that example should point it out as the object most worthy of esteem, that government should faithfully recompense, should regularly reward it, that honor should always accompany its practice, that vice should constantly be despised, that crime should invariably be punished. Is virtue in this situation amongst men? Does the education of man infuse into him just, faithful ideas of happiness, true notions of virtue, dispositions really favorable to the beings with whom he is to live? The examples spread before him, are they suitable to innocence of manners? Are they calculated to make him respect decency, to cause him to love probity, to practice honesty, to value good faith, to esteem equity, to revere conjugal fidelity, to observe exactitude in fulfilling his duties? Religion, which alone pretends to regulate his manners, does it render him sociable? Does it make him pacific? Does it teach him to be humane? The arbiters, the sovereigns of society, are they faithful in recompensing, punctual in rewarding those who have best served their country, in punishing those who have pillaged, who have robbed, who have plundered, who have divided, who have ruined it? Justice, does she hold her scales with a firm, with an even hand, between all the citizens of the state? The laws, do they never support the strong against the weak, favor the rich against the poor, uphold the happy against the miserable? In short, is it an uncommon spectacle to behold crime frequently justified, often applauded, sometimes crowned with success, insolently triumphing, arrogantly striding over that merit which it disdains, over that virtue which it outrages. Well, then, in societies thus constituted, virtue can only be heard by a very small number of peaceable citizens, a few generous souls, who know how to estimate its value, who enjoy it in secret. For the others it is only a disgusting object. They see in it nothing but the supposed enemy to their happiness, or the censor of their individual conduct. In the 10th chapter, which is upon the soul, the author says, "The diversity in the temperament of man is natural, the necessary source of the diversity of passions, of his taste, of his idea of happiness, of his opinions of every kind. Thus this same diversity will be the fatal source of his disputes, of his hatreds, of his injustice, every time he shall reason upon unknown objects, but to which he shall attach the greatest importance. He will never underestimate either himself or others, in speaking of a spiritual soul, or of immaterial substances distinguished from nature. He will from that moment cease to speak the same language, and he will never attach the same ideas to the same words. What then shall be the common standard that shall decide which is the man that thinks with the greatest justice? Propose to a man to change his religion for yours. He will believe you a madman. You will only excite his indignation, elicit his contempt. He will propose to you, in his turn, to adopt his own peculiar opinions. After much reasoning, you will treat each other as absurd beings, ridiculously opinionated, pertinaciously stubborn, and he will display the least folly who shall first yield. But if the adversaries become heated in the dispute, which always happens, when they suppose the matter important, or when they would defend the cause of their own self-love, from thence their passions sharpen, they grow angry, quarrels are provoked, they hate each other, and end by reciprocal injury. It is thus that for opinions which no man can demonstrate, we see the Brahman despised, the Mohammedan hated, the pagan held in contempt, that they oppress and disdain each with the most raucous animosity. The Christian burns the Jew at what is called an auto da fe, because he clings to the faith of his fathers. The Roman Catholic condemns the Protestant to the flames, and makes a conscience of massacring him in cold blood. This reacts in his turn, something the various sects of Christians league together against the incredulous Turk, and for a moment suspend their own bloody disputes, that they may chastise the enemies to the true faith. Then, having glutted their revenge, return with redoubled fury to wreak over again their infuriated vengeance on each other. The 13th chapter argues as follows against the doctrine of the immortality of the soul and a future state. In old age, man extinguishes entirely. His fibers become rigid, his nerves lose their elasticity, his senses are obtunded, his sight grows dim, his ears lose their quickness, his ideas become unconnected, his memory fails, his imagination cools. What then becomes of his soul? Alas, it sinks down with the body, it gets benumbed as it loses its feeling, becomes sluggish as this decays in activity. Like it, when enfeebled by years, it fulfills its functions with pain. This substance which is deemed spiritual, which is considered immaterial, which it is endeavored to distinguish from matter, undergoes the same revolutions, experiences the same vicissitudes, submits to the same modifications as does the body itself. In despite of this proof of the materiality of the soul, of its identity with the body so convincing to the unprejudiced, some thinkers have supposed that although the latter is perishable, the former does not perish, that this portion of man enjoys the especial privilege of immortality, that it is exempt from dissolution, free from those changes of form all the beings in nature undergo. In consequence of this, man is persuaded himself that this privileged soul does not die. It will be asked, perhaps, by what road has man been conducted to form to himself gratuitous ideas of another world? I reply that it is a truth man has no idea of a future life. They are the ideas of the past and the present that furnish his imagination with the materials of which he constructs the edifice of the regions of futurity. Hobbes says we believe that that which is will always be, and that the same causes will have the same effects. Man, in his actual state, has two modes of feeling, one that he approves, another that he disapproves. Thus persuaded that these two modes of feeling must accompany him even beyond his present existence, he placed in the regions of eternity two distinguished abodes, one destined to felicity, the other to misery. The one must contain those who obey the calls of superstition, who believe in its dogmas. The other is a prison, destined to avenge the cause of heaven on all those who shall not faithfully believe the doctrines promulgated by the ministers of a vast variety of superstitions. Has sufficient attention been paid to the fact that results as a necessary consequence from this reasoning, which on examination will be found to have rendered the first place entirely useless, seeing that by the number and contradiction of these various systems, let man believe whichever he may, let him follow it in the most faithful manner, still he must be ranked as an infidel, as a rebel to the divinity, because he cannot believe in all, and those from which he dissents, by a consequence of their own creed, condemn him to the prison house. Such is the origin of the ideas upon a future life, so diffused among mankind. Everywhere may be seen an Elysium and a Tartarus, a paradise and a hell. In a word, two distinguished abodes, constructed according to the imagination of the enthusiasts who have invented them, who have accommodated them to their own peculiar prejudices, to the hopes, to the fears of the people who believe in them. The Indian figures the first of these abodes as one of inaction, of permanent repose, because, being the inhabitant of a hot climate, he has learned to contemplate rest as the extreme of felicity. The Mussulman promises himself corporeal pleasures, similar to those that actually constitute the object of his research in this life. Each figures to himself that on which he has learned to set the greatest value. As for the miserable abode of souls, the imagination of fanatics, who were desirous of governing the people, strove to assemble the most frightful images to render it still more terrible. Fire is of all things that which produces in man the most pungent sensation. Not finding anything more cruel, the enemies to the several dogmas were to be everlastingly punished with this torturing element. Fire, therefore, was the point at which their imagination was obliged to stop. The ministers of the various systems agreed pretty generally that fire would one day avenge their offended divinities. Thus they painted the victims to the anger of the gods, or rather those who questioned their own creeds, as confined in fiery dungeons, as perpetually rolling into a vortex of bituminous flames, as plunged in unfathomable gulfs of liquid sulphur, making the infernal caverns resound with their useless groanings, with their unavailing gnashing of teeth. But it will perhaps be inquired, how could man reconcile himself to the belief of an existence accompanied with eternal torments? Above all, as many, according to their own superstitions, had reason to fear it for themselves. Many causes have concurred to make him adopt so revolting an opinion. In the first place, very few thinking men have ever believed such an absurdity. When they have deigned to make use of their reason, or when they have accredited it, this notion was always counterbalanced by the idea of the goodness, by a reliance on the mercy which they attributed to their respective divinities. In the second place, those who were blinded by their fears never rendered to themselves any account of these strange doctrines, which they either received with awe from their legislators, or which were transmitted to them by their fathers. In the third place, each sees the object of his terrors only at a favorable distance. Moreover, superstition promises him the means of escaping the tortures he believes he has merited. We conclude by quoting the following eloquent passage: "O Nature, sovereign of all beings, and ye her adorable daughters, Virtue, Reason, and Truth, remain forever our reverend protectors. It is to you that belong the praises of the human race. To you appertains the homage of the earth. Show us then, O Nature, that which man ought to do, in order to obtain the happiness which thou makest him desire. Virtue, animate him with thy beneficent fire. Reason, conduct his uncertain steps through the paths of life. Truth, let thy torch illumine his intellect, dissipate the darkness of his road. Banish error from our mind, wickedness from our hearts, confusion from our footsteps. Cause knowledge to extend its salubrious reign, goodness to occupy our souls, serenity to dwell in our bosoms. Let our eyes, so long either dazzled or blindfolded, be at length fixed upon those objects we ought to seek. Dispel forever those mists of ignorance, those hideous phantoms, together with those seducing chimeras, which only serve to lead us astray. Extricate us from that dark abyss into which we are plunged by superstition. Overthrow the fatal empire of delusion. Crumble the throne of falsehood. Wrest from their polluted hands the power they have usurped." End section 21 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina.